Well, I'm going to just get started. And then, of course, as folks have questions, please feel free to just jump right into the chat. Um, I'm going to start with the Lumina findings around confidence in higher education because I get so many good questions about our trends around confidence in institutions more generally. If you're less familiar with Gallup's ongoing research around institutional trust, we've been measuring attitudes towards institutions and confidence in those institutions really for the better part of the last 30 or 40 years now. We track a series of 17 institutions. We ask Americans in general, how confident are they in each of those institutions? And they can say a great deal, quite a lot, some, very little, or none. In the process, we've actually added higher education to that list. So in 2015, we said we really ought to add higher education as an industry. We measure things like small business, the military, Congress, the presidency, the Supreme Court. No one does worse than Congress, of course. So the good news is everyone's really north of congressional support. But when we asked about confidence in higher education back in 2015, what we found at the time was a majority of Americans said they had a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in higher education as an industry, which was, of course, great news for higher education institutions nationally. Over time, what we've seen is that rate has really decreased. So when we measured again in 2018, you'll see that we had essentially just less than half of the American public saying they had a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in higher education as an industry. We measured again in 2023, that rate had dropped actually below 40% and remained there in 2024. Now, you'll have to remember where we were in 2024 when we kind of counted that new essential low for higher education as an industry. We measure in June of each year, and we're really coming off of the heels of quite a lot of protests surrounding issues related to Israel-Palestine conflict. And there was, I think, a lot of turmoil in general in the news around higher education as an institution. Fast forward, what we found at that time was actually the percent of Americans who said they had a great deal or quite a lot of confidence remained rather stable from 2023 to 2024, which surprised us a little bit just given the news coverage and news cycle. But the percent that said they had very little or no confidence had actually increased to an all-time high, which was unfortunate. What we found this year when we measured, and we actually just put these results out into the field, so this is kind of late breaking news as of about a week and a half ago, is that now about 42% of Americans say they have a great deal or quite a lot of confidence. That actually represents the first time we've seen an increase in net confidence, which I'll talk a little bit about some of our theories around that. But this is really the first time we've seen the rate of confidence increase, not just in general, but really among all groups in which we measure. One of the nice parts about this research, and you'll see this if you go to our website on news.gallup.com and you sift around a bit, is that we do a lot of subgroup reporting. So we've looked at these rates among Republicans and Democrats, those who have higher education themselves and those who do not, et cetera. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the groups for which we've seen are historically a little more or less positive. But all of that, by the way, is made publicly available. So all of the research that I'll share here today is on our website. If you just go to news.gallup.com and you put in Lumina Gallup higher education research, you'll quickly find all of our key findings from a series of reports that we've released in partnership with the foundation. Now, when we look at confidence in higher education overall, as I mentioned, we see that essentially less than half of Americans are having a lot or great deal or quite a lot of confidence. But we also see some key differences between confidence in 2-year versus 4-year institutions. Last year in the spring of 2024 was actually the first time we've ever asked about individual confidence levels among the two different types of institutions. We really generally have historically focused just on higher education as an industry. This year we said, or last year we said, why don't we ask about the two different types of institutions? Because of course our hypothesis is there might be differences among them. What we found at the time was that there was a lot more confidence in 2-year than there were 4-year institutions. That remains the same, by the way, in 2025 when we measured again. Similar to our overall trend, we did see a net increase in confidence overall in 2-year and 4-year institutions. 4-year institutions had a little bit more room to improve in this area because confidence again was lower for them. But again, we saw confidence really improve across both types of institutions. When we look at some of the net change that we've seen over time, we have seen historically that rates are lower among Republicans than they are Democrats on this issue of confidence in institutions. That's true for the overall trend. That's true for the 4-year and 2-year question that we ask. But we saw an increase really in every group in which we measured when we asked about overall confidence. And then we saw that same increase essentially on 4-year and 2-year institutions individually. Now, again, Republicans had a little bit more opportunity for improvement because they were more negative about higher education as an institution historically. But what we saw is that there was a net positive change really among all the groups for whom we measured. When we look at 4-year colleges and universities in 2024 versus 2025, we saw a net improvement of 8 percentage points for Democrats for whom we surveyed. And then we saw 10 and 11 percentage points for independents and Republicans, respectively. So rather significant changes. And I should caveat this when I say significant changes. I'm thinking both about statistical significance, but also substantive differences. Our margin of sampling error, just for the sake of kind of example, tends to be about 2 to 4 percentage points for any of our individual studies. So you can see some of these changes are far outside of that overall margin of sampling error, really signaling a positive change in overall attitudes towards higher education. Now, when we ask Americans overall how confident they are in the institution of higher education, we also ask them for the first time in 2024 why they were or weren't confident. So for those who said they were very confident or had a lot of confidence in higher education as an industry, we asked as a follow-up, what makes you confident in higher education as an institution? There were a series of answers people could give us. We actually asked it on an open-ended basis. The benefit of that is we're able to recode people into a series of categories, and you'll see those categories are represented on the screen. So we looked at, for example, the category of value, right? People saying that they feel like it's good for people to be informed, education has a positive impact on their worldview, gives them a better sense of purpose, etc. You also see we saw examples of people describing what they would classify as really good training and quality education offered by higher education institutions nationally. We also heard a lot about opportunity, the idea that higher education opens more doors for graduates. And then we heard a lot about innovation, about the fact that higher education institutions were really an important kind of test bed of innovation nationally. We also heard about some personal experiences with higher education that were quite powerful and poignant that we captured. And then we heard about accessibility in general, the idea that it was available to anybody who essentially wanted it. When you look across 2024 to 2025, what you'll see is for those who are confident in higher education, value comes to the top of the list as the reason that they are confident. So 27% of Americans for whom they said they had a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in 2024 said it was because they felt like there was a strong value to the US higher education system. You compare that to 2025, we actually saw a slight uptick, just about around that margin of error at 30%. And then you'll see second to that is providing good quality training. The idea that US higher education systems are providing a valuable quality education. And that was really the second most offered reason that people said they had confidence, and that went up to 24% in 2025. You'll see the additional rates for these other reasons. I'll flip forward to the reasons people said that they were not confident, which of course is also incredibly interesting. We heard a lot of concerns around political issues, the idea that higher education as an industry has just become increasingly political, which I'm sure you all feel on a day-to-day basis. That was certainly the most important reason in 2024 and remained even more important in 2025 as to why those who said that they had very little confidence in the institution said so. So we saw a lot around political agendas, concerns around indoctrination, the belief that institutions were either too liberal in their instruction or in their teachings, not allowing students to think for themselves or having an agenda in the process. Again, given current news cycles, this is not too shocking, but the rate is very interesting to track over time to see what extent it changes. And in 2024, when we asked this question, we found 28% of people said that they were not confident in higher education, and the reason was largely because of the political nature of the institution. You compare that today to 2025, we see that rate has increased to 38%. The second most commonly reported reason people said that they weren't confident was concern around the focus of higher education institutions, what they were teaching in terms of the skills being offered, and the extent to which some of those skills are durable in the larger employment market. That came up quite a bit. We saw 35% of those who said that they had essentially very little or no confidence in 2024 said that was the reason. Compare that to today at 32%. Again, we saw cost was also a major reason people were not very confident in higher education. This has come up again and again in all of our research, which is probably not surprising to so many of you who know that this is a major reason those who are not currently enrolled report that they're unenrolled. But we saw cost was a major concern in 2024 and still remains a major concern in 2025, although those political agendas tended to take over in terms of their importance. So 35% of those who we surveyed last year who said they had very little or no confidence that it was because of concerns around cost or the overall expense of our higher education degree in the United States. Compare that to today at about 24%. So again, the rate has decreased, but still remains one of the top reasons people report they have very little or no confidence in the institution in general. We heard a little bit about administration here as well. This really increased from 2024 to 2025, represents one of our more significant increases in terms of the reasons people said they had very little or no confidence. Concerns about leadership and those who are in charge of these higher education institutions. Again, not too surprising if you think where we were about a month ago in the news cycle that was currently playing out was quite a lot of conflict among individual presidents and leaders, as well as senior officials from a policy perspective. And so some of that conflict might be coming through in this individual research as well. We heard a little bit about inequality that was rather consistent from 2024 to 2025. And again, we heard a little bit about political issues, specifically conflict with the current Republican Trump administration as a major reason. Some reported that they were not exhibiting a lot of confidence in higher education overall. So some of that might seem like bad news, especially for those of you who work with institutions and know the incredible work that is going into educating their students. But there's so much good news in all of our research. The confidence in institutions research comes from our longstanding trends around measuring overall confidence in all US-based institutions. But we also have an incredible body of research that we're conducting on an ongoing basis with the foundation, where we're really trying to understand the currently enrolled student experience, but also perspectives of higher education among those who aren't currently enrolled and either have stopped out of a post-secondary pathway or maybe have never before enrolled in a higher education institution. Each fall, starting in 2020, we've been interviewing about 10 to 15,000 Americans who do not have a degree or credential themselves to better understand their perspectives of and experiences with higher education institutions. When we started the research in 2020, our real focus was understanding the currently enrolled student perspective. As you will recall, if you kind of take yourself back a few years, in 2020, there was so much speculation about how the pandemic would really impact higher ed. Some people posited that there would be this incredible enrollment surge because many people wouldn't understand what was coming economically, and they might turn to higher education to upskill or reskill as they think about how to re-enter the workforce in a more competitive market. Then there was another theory that higher education enrollments would decline precipitously because of the real benefit or perceived benefit about a traditional on-campus experience and the fact that that might not be accessible given the need to close certain campuses or have more of a remote or hybrid learning environment for students. And so the big question among all of us was what will happen to higher education in the pandemic and really heading into the fall of 2020. So in the spring of 2020, when we met with Lumina Foundation, we said, let's survey about 6,000 currently enrolled college students, those who are pursuing both a 2-year and a 4-year pathway, and just capture a little bit more about the quality of their experience accessing that education. That really was the impetus for a more robust study where we said, okay, let's start capturing the stopped out population. Let's start capturing those who don't have a degree credential themselves. The result is really a holistic perspective of higher education among all of these individuals who don't have a degree or credential themselves. We also have an entire body of research at Gallup around those who have completed a degree or credential, which many of you may know us through the Gallup alumni survey work that we've released over time. So all of that is also available on our website. But for today's conversation, I'll continue to focus on this more recent research via the State of Higher Education study in partnership with Lumina Foundation. And since we started essentially in 2020, we've asked a really important question about the perceived value of a 2 or 4-year degree that you see on the screen here today. We say compared to 20 years ago, how important is it for people today to have a 2 or 4-year degree in order for them to have a successful career? And this question is really born out of this ongoing question that we always get and a hypothesis that we hear a lot from the field, which is maybe higher education isn't deemed as valuable as it used to be, right? Maybe people feel like there are other pathways to a successful career in life, and we're seeing that bear out vis-a-vis enrollment rates. So we actually ask individuals, compared to 20 years ago, how important is it? What we find is there's a net positive perspective here. That is, a majority of all Americans say they believe a degree is critical to having a successful career. And this has been pretty stable over time. You'll see in 2021, when we first began measuring, 44% said it was more important, 36% said it was equally important. A slightly lower rate today say that it's more or equally important, but we still have a majority of Americans who are saying they believe that 2-year or 4-year degree pathway is the clearest pathway to a successful job and a successful life. Now, this is a slightly different perspective, but a same concept, right? When we ask about overall value, we've asked over the course of the last few years how valuable Americans perceive one of these 5 individual pathways that they could take, whether it be obtaining a certification, a certificate, an associate degree, a bachelor's degree, or a graduate degree. What you'll see here is when we say, in general, how valuable are each of the following types of degrees or credentials, the majority of those who don't have a degree or credential themselves say they think each of these individual pathways are extremely or very valuable. You'll see graduate and bachelor's degrees perform particularly well, as do certifications. Our theory, of course, there is that we have 2 types of degrees that we know pay a significant premium in the market, but we also have a credential via certification that we know takes relatively little time to complete. When you compare it to a bachelor's or graduate degree, it might be perceived as a strong value. Overall, though, what you'll see here is we have essentially more than half of Americans saying they think each of these 5 pathways are extremely or very valuable, which should come as good news when we consider some of those confidence metrics that I mentioned earlier. Now, those who are currently enrolled see increased value among all these pathways, which makes sense. They've already made the choice to essentially leap into one of these pathways themselves. But we still see a majority of those who are not enrolled, and even those who stopped out, saying they think each of these 5 pathways are extremely or very valuable. Over the past year, we've also asked individuals whether or not they've considered pursuing a specific degree or pathway. We've asked about an associate degree, a certificate, a bachelor's, or an industry certification, just to try and get a better sense of what consideration looks like. The good news is that we find a majority of Americans have considered either one or more of these pathways. When we look at individual pathways, we see highest consideration rates are among those with an associate degree, which makes sense, right? Because we know that there are more folks kind of cycling out and stopping out of those pathways, so there might be higher consideration to actually re-enrolling in some of those opportunities. But again, if you consider the fact that people could have selected each of these individual pathways, we see a majority report that they've essentially considered one or more of them, which again is great news when we consider overall enrollment trends in the United States. Now, the stopped out population has become incredibly interesting to us as well as other researchers, of course, because we know there are a tremendous amount of Americans, 41 million plus, who now report that essentially they've stopped out of a post-secondary pathway. And it's really critical for us to understand, would it be worth it for them to return? What would it take for them to return? So we've asked among those who are currently enrolled, those who've stopped out, those who have never been before enrolled, generally speaking, do you think the investment that you would make in each of these individual pathways would be worth it for you, whether it be a 2-year or a 4-year degree? Those who are currently enrolled obviously see tremendous value in each of those pathways. Those who've stopped out also see a lot of value. So I think it's a good reminder that those who've stopped out have stopped out for very practical reasons, but it's not necessarily because they don't believe the degree would be valuable. There are likely other barriers that are really getting in their way. And we've seen that play out in all of the research that we've conducted. We actually ask individuals which of the following describes why you've stopped out of a post-secondary pathway. And overwhelmingly, we hear cost is the major reason that they've stopped out. It's not necessarily perceived value. Even for those who've never before enrolled themselves, we see 63% believe that a 4-year education would be worth it for them, and 72% say the same about a 2-year pathway. We've also asked about the fairness of prices charged by 4-year and 2-year institutions individually and in combination. And I will say that's an area for which people are generally much more critical of higher education. So while there's a ton of great news about perceived value of a higher education degree in the United States, there's also quite a lot of criticism about the overall prices that these institutions charge. When we asked, do you think 4-year colleges charge fair prices for what they offer students and graduates, just 18% of Americans say yes, 59% say no, and about 22% say they're unsure. When we ask the same about two-year colleges, we see two-year institutions perform far better for the obvious reasons that they're obviously less expensive. We see 40% say that they think that that's a fair price that's charged. 36% say no. 24% say that they're unsure. It's a complicated question. We also know that there's a lot of ambiguity in terms of what students actually pay when they obtain a degree. We, in 2024, conducted a really interesting experiment that's available on our website that I didn't include in detail here, but I think bears repeating as really important research, which looks at price transparency for prospective students. We actually asked individuals in the survey. We told them what the overall sticker price was for an institution in their state that was a public flagship. And then we said, but what do you think an average student pays? We anticipated a lot of people would overestimate total cost of attendance. We thought at the time, well, there's so much publicity about overall cost of a degree or credential. Maybe people are overestimating the price and they're kind of counting themselves out of a post-secondary pathway. We did find that about a quarter of people were overestimating the total cost of attendance of what a student would actually pay once we account for discounting and the easing of tuition. We found that about a quarter were essentially within $5,000 of the total cost of attendance. But then we found about a half that were essentially underestimating the total cost of attendance. And what was really interesting about that is for even those for whom they were underestimating total cost, they still said it was too expensive to enroll themselves. So it's a good reminder that even for those who are actually wrong and are underestimating what the total cost of attendance would be, they still feel like it's out of reach and inaccessible to them. Now, we ask individuals the extent to which they think that the prices for four-year and two-year colleges are fair. We do see some significant differences between those who are currently enrolled themselves, those who've stopped out, those who've never before enrolled. So this is just a slightly kind of drilled down perspective on the research that I just shared. But for current bachelor students, we find 20% say that they think the prices charged are essentially fair for what a four-year college provides. For those who are attending an associate's program, we find that rate is much higher. For those who've stopped out of a bachelor's program, we find just 15% feel like the price charged by those institutions is, quote, fair. And for those who've stopped out of an associate program, we also find more negative results, which is not surprising given the fact that cost is often a reason those students have stopped out. For those who've never before enrolled, we see a lot of criticism among the total price charge. 19% of those who've never enrolled feel like the four-year price is fair, compared to 32% of them who say the same thing about two-year pathways. Now, I've focused a lot on the kind of unenrolled population, stopped out population, but so much of our research in the Lumina Foundation and Gallup State of Higher Education study is really focused on the currently enrolled student perspective and elevating that perspective nationally. There's so much talk about students, and often we don't talk to students in terms of what they're experiencing on campus in real time. And we also know that there's a lot of anecdotes that go into the press that can really take on a life of their own. And there can be the perception that that's happening at every single campus. So a lot of this research is designed to really understand what is the lived experience for currently enrolled students. Is it positive? Is it negative? In what ways could it be improved from a policy or practitioner perspective? And one of the questions that we've asked over time is the extent to which students feel respected on campus. We know respect is so critical. It's very hard to be present academically and in your classwork if you don't feel respected by your faculty. And similarly, if you don't feel respected by other students, it's very hard to engage fully in the campus-based experience. So we ask individuals on a 5-point scale, with 1 being the fact that they strongly disagree, and 5 being strongly agree, the extent to which they strongly agree or disagree with a series of statements in the surveys. And one of them is you're treated with respect by other students at your campus. Another is you're treated with respect by faculty at your institution. What we see overall is that the good news is the majority of students do feel as if they're treated with respect. If we look at those who strongly agree with this statement, we see a net positive. Essentially, 3/4 say they feel like they're treated with respect by other students at their institution. 82% that say the same for faculty. So again, a net positive. When we look at different groups, we do see some slight differences by demographic of that student. And here I'm focusing really on the bachelor's population. You'll see here 73% of female students for whom we interview say they feel like they're treated with respect by other students. A slightly higher percentage, although generally within the margin of error, 76% of men say the same. We see relatively similar percentages among those who say they feel like they're treated with respect by their faculty members. As we move down additional subgroups for which we analyze, we really see the biggest differences on the basis of race. Specifically for Black or African American students, we see a very different experience on campus. Just 69% of those students say they feel like they're treated with respect by other students at their institution. You compare that to 75% of those who identify as Asian, Hispanic, or white. That really points to a disparate experience. And they're also less likely than other students to report that they feel like they're treated with respect by their faculty members. So some key differences there by subgroup that I think are worth tracking over time. We don't really see differences by political party at all in this question. And you'll see that continues to be a trend for a lot of the questions we ask about belonging and respect on campus. Now, we also ask students the extent to which they feel like they belong at their institution. We know belonging, again, much like respect, is so critical to being present and really engaging in their campus-based experience. And when we ask whether or not students feel like they belong at their institution, we see 70% strongly agree or agree with that statement overall. But we do see some differences by subgroup, not rather significant, with the exception of gender, where we do see 67% of women report that they feel like they belong at their institution compared to 73% of men. Again, just outside that margin of error, so a statistically significant difference, although relatively similar rates. When we look at this issue of race ethnicity, we don't see some of the same differences we see with respect as it relates to belonging. And when we look at the issue of political party identification, we don't really see significant differences by political party. And again, that's rather consistent throughout our research, where we see Democrats, Independents, and Republican students essentially report a rather similar experience on their campus. Now, we've also asked individuals the extent to which they've been discriminated against, harassed, or disrespected at some point at the institution. And this could have been by a faculty member, it could have been a staff member, it could have been another student. We don't really distinguish between them. Again, what we find here is perhaps the good news is that a minority, a rather small group of students are reporting these negative experiences. However, there are significant differences by subgroup. And again, Black or African American students are really diverging from all other groups in this case. We see 18% of them say that they feel like they've been harassed while at their institution, 21% say they feel like they've been disrespected, and about a quarter say they feel like they've been discriminated against. You compare that with relatively low rates of Asian, Hispanic, and white students who say the same. On the basis of party, we really don't see differences. So really not a difference of political party or affiliation. It's really specifically around race, ethnicity, for which we see those significant differences. Now, a key part of the research, especially in 2024, was this issue of free speech, and we brought it forward again in 2025. We really wanted to understand the extent to which students could speak freely on their campus. We know it's critical for a variety of reasons, including the extent to which students might feel like they're treated with respect or they belong at their institution. But we also know when you speak freely, you're more likely to engage in diverse and different perspectives, which we actually find is strongly associated with believing your degree is worth the cost. In fact, when we conducted our alumni survey years ago, we found one of the most important drivers of overall perceived value was the extent to which you'd interacted with somebody who had a different view than you. And it didn't necessarily need to be a different political view, but a different perspective. When we ask individuals how they would rate their institution in each of the following areas and promoting free speech specifically, we actually found a majority of all groups for whom we interviewed rated their institution really positively on this piece. There were a few differences by political party, but they were very slight. In fact, we found the vast majority of Democrats, Independents, and Republicans all said they would rate their institution really positively in this area. And again, for the purposes of this presentation, I'm really just focusing on those four-year campuses for which we know this has been a more significant consideration and topic. We also asked individuals the extent to which they felt like they could freely express their perspective on campus. And again, what we find is the vast majority of those for whom we interview report that they feel like they can speak freely on campus across a variety of topics, including things like opinions on sexual orientation and gender identity, liberal political viewpoints, opinions on issues about race or religion, or the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, conservative political viewpoints, and even opinions that are sympathetic to the Israeli population as we consider that Israeli and Palestine conflict. We did see slight differences across these different topics. So you'll see, for example, 53% of students for whom we surveyed said that they felt like this was a place where students could freely express their perspective on conservative viewpoints. compared with 67% who said the same on liberal political viewpoints. But when we ask individual students the extent to which they feel like they can freely express themselves, we actually see that conservative and liberal students are just as likely to say that they can express themselves freely. So there is a perception that liberal viewpoints might be more widely accepted or promoted, but we don't necessarily see that in individual experiences among conservative students in the same way. I'm going to stop there because I know I shared a lot of findings, and I'd love to hear from you all in terms of your questions. And I apologize because I couldn't look at the chat as I was talking, so I'm sure there's some great questions in here. But I saw that Natalie shared the news.gallup.com site, so thanks so much, Natalie, for putting that in the chat. And again, as I mentioned, all of our findings that we share are made publicly available in a series of reports that we provide. Usually over the course of the spring of each year, we're actually currently designing the survey for the fall of 2025. So there will be a series of findings coming out in the spring of 2026, but all the findings that we've released today are there. So maybe I'll pause there and would love to hear any questions that folks have if they want to put something into the chat or come off mute.
Yeah, so if people should feel free to put stuff in the Q&A or in the chat. And I have a few questions to start off with, and then we can go from there. So
Right.
Um, you talked a little bit about the numbers of folks that you interview or that you have, but can you talk a little bit about your methodology? Like, how do you get to these folks? And
Yeah, great question. So, unlike some surveys where individuals are surveyed through their institution, we actually go direct to the student population. So, we actually don't require that an individual institution necessarily participate, so to speak. We actually go direct to the student, and then we recruit them in via a representative sample of currently enrolled college students. We actually even weight the sample just to make sure that we're representing the right proportion of individual subgroups who tend to under respond to surveys. So, for example, we find students who are first generation students, lower socioeconomic status students, individuals for whom they are part time or even a 2-year program are a little less likely to respond to a survey. So, we actually weight the sample just to make sure we adjust and it is truly nationally representative using IPEDS data. But we actually survey everybody via the web. We find that this population in particular is really accessible via that methodology. And it's essentially a 15-minute or so survey, depending upon your individual kind of experience. So if you're currently enrolled, we ask you where you went to college. We also ask you a series of questions about your experience while in that college. If you're not currently enrolled, you've stopped out, we do capture the institution that you were last enrolled in, as well as the type of program you were last enrolled in, just so we can better understand for those who are kind of cycling out of higher education, some of the patterns associated with it. And then for those who've never before enrolled, we capture all of the series of their kind of core demographics, as well as the questions that you saw here in terms of attitudes, opinions, experiences. So there are essentially like 3 different paths that a potential or prospective respondent could take within that survey based on the individual experiences that they provide as they go.
great. Um, so I know you talked a lot about what came out of the state of higher ed, and you and I talked a lot about the free speech report when we talked, and you put a lot of that in there, which I think was really helpful. Um, do you have other reports that you know of that are coming down the line that might be interesting? Or
Yeah, great question. So some of the other reports that I think are particularly interesting that are on the website right now, for those who are interested, we had a cost and value report that we provided this spring that really dove deeply into this issue of perceived value of a post-secondary pathway. Some of that I shared here today in terms of just overall perceptions of the fairness of price and the extent to which people feel like the degree would be worth the cost to them. But we also have a series of other questions, some of which I shared anecdotally around price transparency, et cetera, that really do a better job of explaining just how important cost is. And I know that seems obvious because, of course, we all know cost is really important to prospective and currently enrolled students. But, I can't underscore enough just how present that concern is for those who are stopping out or have never before enrolled in a post-secondary pathway. I think conventional wisdom is that people might not be enrolling because they don't see value in a post-secondary degree or credential. That's not really what we see in our research. We see that a lot more of it is related to the total sticker price associated with an institution and this perception that's highly inaccessible to most Americans. In fact, over the years, we've asked a question that I didn't feature in today's report, but it's available on our website, where we ask how many Americans do people feel have the ability to enroll in a post-secondary pathway if they want to? And we find that the vast majority of Americans feel like very few are able or can access higher education as a system. There's this perception it's very elite, inaccessible, There's also, I think, a lack of understanding about the range of post-secondary pathways that are available, which again, I think for those of us in the field feels really frustrating because we know there's so many different ways in which you can engage with a post-secondary pathway, but that's not really reaching most Americans based on our research. So there's still this need to kind of cut through and help people understand that you don't necessarily have to be even on campus, right? You can be in an online program, obtaining your bachelor's, graduate degree, associate degree, et cetera. And that are other pathways that are much more financially accessible, but also physically accessible. The other thing I would just raise about that research that I think is really important is just the value of flexibility in programs. Second to cost, we find flexibility is like the most important reason people report that they're not currently enrolled themselves or that they've stopped out of a post-secondary pathway. And that's flexibility in terms of actual physical access to a campus, but it's also flexibility in terms of course offerings and times.
Thank you. Question from the audience. So, someone is asking, are there differences by region of the US in the findings about opinions and perceptions? And then I would also add maybe, do you see differences in rural versus urban?
Oh, good question. We do not see differences by region or urbanicity, which I think is really interesting. I would distinguish that between other research that we've done in partnership with Walton Family Foundation, where we really dive into the rural student experience. We do see some key differences in the K-12 perspective, specifically issues of feeling like there's a lot of opportunity and jobs available to students as they consider kind of their post-secondary pathway or whether or not they'll go straight into the job market. For those findings, we actually do see a significant differences between those who live in rural or more urban areas. We don't actually see some of that in our research here.
Great. We have another question in the chat. So I noticed that there were equal feelings of discrimination between male and female respondents in 2025. Has this stayed consistent over time? Have there been improvements for women with better support representation over time? And have there been any trends for this number increasing for men with the rising gender gap on campuses?
A great question. We've actually looked at this also from the alumni perspective in the past, the extent to which female versus male students report that they experience issues of discrimination or harassment on campus. When we look at this issue of assault on campus, we do find female college graduates report that there were a lot more times that they felt physically unsafe on campus than their male peers. So it's not all good news as it relates to female versus male experiences on campus based upon our research. In this particular research, we're not seeing as much of a gender gap. But in that research, where we look at college graduates' perspectives and really asking them to reflect upon their experience while enrolled, we do see some important differences in perceived safety on campus. So I would say, our research suggests there's still significant concern on a lot of college campuses for female students in particular, as well as for those who identify as transgender or have transitioned genders. But we don't necessarily see in our state of higher education research. I think it's more of a reflection on some of the differences in the way we're asking those questions.
Great. Progress made, but always more work to be done.
Yeah, good, good
Absolutely.
glass half full perspective.
Yeah. Um, so thinking about student voice, and like that's something I think, Compact is really thinking about is how do we integrate more student voice into the work that we do? For folks who are on the call thinking about how should they start to integrate more student voice into some of the work that they're doing? Do you have any tips for that?
Oh gosh, it's such a good question. I mean, I think what has been most powerful to us in the ongoing research that we've conducted is the lived experience is often so different than the anecdotes we hear in the media. And it's not to say that the media isn't doing a great job reporting on the lived experience. I think they're doing as great a job as they can, but we know that anecdotes can become powerful and they kind of take on a life of their own. When we quantify these topics, we see a very different experience on campus. So I guess my takeaway would be not to assume that an individual story or anecdote represents an entire experience on campus. In fact, I would say that's kind of the opposite of what we find in our ongoing research. We released a report last year looking at policies that could have the potential to impact enrollment-based decisions. We asked specifically about the extent to which people were considering state policies on issues like guns, divisive topics, and reproductive policies when they were deciding where to go to college. Now, we know some people might not be able to leave their state, so it's a moot point. But for those who could leave their state, we wanted to understand how important those individual state policies might be to making enrollment-based decisions. And then we also want to understand, for those who reported it was influencing them, in what direction would they like to see those policies change? We found for students from all different types of backgrounds, conservative and liberal, they were looking for institutions located in states that were less restrictive when it came to things like reproductive rights, and more restrictive when it comes to things like gun ownership and gun policies in that state, and also less restrictive when it came to divisive topics. They wanted faculty, staff, and students to feel like they could express themselves freely. So I think that's a good example of research that sometimes runs counter to the narrative that we see often reported via qualitative research that's conducted. So I love qualitative research. I think it provides really important context, but I would say our research really underscores how important it is to measure these topics across all students in a quantitative way.
Great. So, you mentioned this a little bit and in the topics that you were talking about that, Israel, Palestine, gender discrimination, reproductive rights, all of that. When you're thinking about the questions for next year, because obviously you've been doing this yearly, do you see that as something that's coming up more and more with like how students make decisions about campuses or how they feel comfortable on their campuses with so much of that politics making its way to our campuses these days?
Yeah, it's a great question because, in some ways we see higher education has become more political than ever. But when we ask currently enrolled college students how they're experiencing their campuses, we don't hear about some of these political topics. We hear about things like cost, ability to remain enrolled, mental health, emotional stress that they're experiencing. So I would say that while we know political kind of components are really important to how people are experiencing their campus, it's not to say that things like the Israeli-Palestine conflict and the protests happening on campus aren't important. I would say that there are also practical considerations that are weighing far more heavily on students' minds that they consider whether or not they'll stay at an individual institution, and frankly, whether they can afford to stay. I think cost continues to be the most important reason we see students are stopping out, but mental health and emotional stress is also incredibly important. We see really a rising tide of unhappiness in all of our research that we conduct here at Gallup, not just among currently enrolled college students, but currently enrolled college students are feeling it very heavily. We know their campuses are really struggling to respond to it. And I worry a lot about institutions' ability to respond to that mental health crisis because we know it's so pervasive. So I would say, emotional stress, mental health, financial considerations are really the ones that are most important to most students. It's not necessarily individual protests that are happening on their campus because we know actually the majority of campuses aren't experiencing protests. And if they are, many of them are actually peaceful and productive and strong dialogue and really a good example of free speech on their campuses. So you know, I don't want to discount the political pieces of this conversation. They're really important, but I would say as we think about like the practicalities and the day-to-day for most students, mental health and emotional stress are far more important.
So I know when you and I checked in and talked about some of this stuff, we had talked a little bit about like what are some of those experiences that college students feel are most transformative? Like like what do those things look like? And I know you had some older research that looked at some of that, saying internships, a faculty member who was, cared about them. Do you guys have any plans to do some research on that again? Or because I'm just thinking about the belonging piece and how students
Yeah.
find belonging.
Yes, stay tuned. We hope to repeat some of that research in the fall and actually give it a little bit of a new spin on things as we'll be introducing a series of other measurements. But the research that you're mentioning is our Gallup alumni survey work, which represents ongoing research we've conducted since 2013, where we're measuring college graduates' perspectives of their alma mater, really looking for those who have a four-year degree or higher. What was their experience in obtaining that bachelor's degree? We actually capture the institution that they obtained their degree from, so we know institutional characteristics. And then we ask a series of questions about their experience while enrolled and then their experiences upon graduation. The purpose of that research has really been to understand what are the individual experiences students have to have while enrolled to really be successful upon graduation. And when we talk about success, we're really talking about feeling engaged in their employment experience, not just being employed, but actually feeling purpose in their work and also thriving in their well-being. When we ask currently enrolled college students or even prospective students, why have you considered a post-secondary pathway? They very clearly say it's because I want a better job and a better life. So we thought in 2013, well, if college is supposed to be about having a better job or a better life, we ought to be measuring that and not just employment-based outcomes alone, not just earnings alone, which is the traditional way in which we've kind of measured the value of a college degree. Not to say earnings aren't important. We know that people need a return on their investment, but we also know they're looking for a little bit more, right? They're looking to gain a job that they really feel like they're contributing powerfully to, but that they're deriving purpose from. So that's really been the focus of that research. And over the course of the last really 10 or so years, what we've uncovered is a series of powerful experiences that when people have them while enrolled, really increase the odds of being engaged at work and thriving in their lives. Having an internship that allowed them to apply what they were learning in the classroom, not just an internship, but an internship that had that application is really critical. Having a mentor, uh, feeling as if they had support from faculty and staff while on campus. We also know the issues of other engagement experiences, like being extremely involved in extracurricular activities, working on a project that took a semester or more to complete, feeling cared for as a person, not just as a student, are all really important to increasing the odds of being successful upon graduation. So we fondly call it kind of our big six experiences that we know if you have them while enrolled, essentially double the odds of being engaged or thriving in your well-being upon graduation. So those tend to be our best practice examples for institutions to really engage in, but we continue to revitalize that research. And I always invite, questions if anybody has suggestions about what we should be measuring in that ongoing research of alumni.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I think we've hit the questions that people put in the chat or in the Q&A. I did, I've put a couple of links in here and you certainly can subscribe to get all of this. I love getting the Gallup emails because I think there's always some really, really interesting information. We will share out all of the stuff that we've shared here today as well. So thank you all so much. And thank you, Stephanie, so much for all this information. It has been really, really helpful.
Yeah, thanks for having me and thanks for joining.